One of the things that I think I love the most about Bernie Sanders is that the more you look at his record and the more you find, the more you end up liking him. Because what you find is that he's been consistent for the entirety of his life. The same thing he was fighting for and saying when he was a college student is what he's still saying today. However, when you compare that with other candidates, the deeper you dive, the more you look, the less you end up liking them, because you just find traits about them that are undesirable, you find contradictions in their record, and you find things that make them not someone who progressives want to support. So, for example, we learned that Kamala Harris, who wants to face off against Donald Trump in 2020, actually took money from Donald Trump in the form of a campaign contribution. And back in 2011, she accepted the first contribution from a Trump. And then in 2014, she took money from his daughter Ivanka. Now, when it comes to Joe Biden, we recently learned that he's been getting advice from corporate executives on how to speak to and appeal to millennials, presumably so he can avoid another Pokemon Go to the polls moment, which was, I think, probably one of the worst moments of Hillary Clinton's 2016 campaign. So it's clear that he has a problem with millennials because he keeps talking down to us and pissing us off. So he's trying to figure out a way to talk to millennials and get them to like him. But if you have to do that, you're already doing it wrong. The fact that you have to talk to corporate executives shows that you're not going to be able to appeal to millennials, Joe. So learning this about Joe Biden in and of itself makes me like him less. So that's what we're finding out about the other 2020 presidential contenders. Meanwhile, here's what we found with regard to Bernie Sanders. He was talking about climate change back in 1989, and he was saying something then that we're all saying now with regard to climate change, specifically the mainstream media's lack of interest in the subject.
We face, as all people know, an ecological crisis in our time, whether it's acid rain, the destruction of the ozone layer, the greenhouse effect. One would think that the CBSs and the NBCs of the world will be doing prime-time specials on these programs, having different scientists, talking about the issues, involving people in understanding what's going on in terms of our planet. They don't. The function of television is to make as much money as possible for the owners of the television stations and for those people who advertise the 30-second ads on television. So I would say that we're not going to bring about serious political change in this country until we deal with the media, which more and more is being swallowed up by large conglomerates.
What's crazy is that everything he said there is still 100% true today. And while Americans are only now waking up to just how terrible the mainstream corporate media is, he was saying the same thing that we're all saying now back in 1989. And it's not like when it comes to climate change, that was a one-off for Bernie Sanders, because there's another video from 2 years earlier in 1987 where he was being a leader on climate change and was actually teaching a class of middle schoolers about climate change and what it means and how it would affect them in the future.
Some of you may have seen there were some articles in the newspaper recently about the destruction of the ozone layer and the fact that the climate, the temperature on Earth may rise a few degrees. Is that significant? Does that just mean that the summer will be a little bit warm, we'll go swimming another day or two? Okay?
Well, it's not, it doesn't seem significant, but if it gets like hardly any warmer, the polar ice caps could melt and like flood the oceans.
Precisely.
And flood us.
The point being that if you don't think that raising temperature a few degrees is an enormous consequence, you're very wrong. Because it doesn't mean just that, oh boy, I can go swimming a few more days. It means that the type of rays that come down from the sun will make us vulnerable to disease. It will have an impact on the polar caps in melting them. And it gets back to the point that she made, which is that everything relates to everything else. Okay, when that loudspeaker interrupted us, it relates to us. It relates to the conversation that we have. Everything relates to everything else. The environment is a very, very fragile system of interrelationships. And if one thing is disrupted, it'll have an effect on everything else. For example, if the raising of the temperature has an effect on drought, and I don't know that it will, but it might, and on the growing of food, on the growing of wheat, what does that mean in terms of the way we live? Yeah.
Well, if the weed is destroyed, then we're going to lose a lot of the food that we eat.
Right, exactly. And if pollution has an effect on water, what does it obviously mean? Yep.
That like we're going to dehydrate.
Well, obviously you can't live without fresh water. And as you know, in many areas of the country now we live right here on the lake and we have a problem that I'll talk about in a second. But in many areas of the country now, water, we take water for granted. It's not a big deal. But in many areas of the country, the availability of fresh drinking water is a major, major problem, and it is getting worse.
That right there is exactly what leadership looks like. Now, after learning everything that we've learned about Bernie Sanders' past and seeing these videos, my question is, if you're progressive, how can you not support Bernie Sanders? That's really the question we should be asking ourselves. Because think about this, it's not just like he was correct on climate change. You can go back, watch old C-SPAN videos of him on the House and the Senate floor talking about mass incarceration, talking about the Iraq War, talking about legalizing marijuana. You can find newspaper articles of him as the mayor of Burlington, Vermont, championing LGBTQ rights, allowing a gay pride parade to take place in Burlington, with a city council that was rampantly homophobic that wanted to kill his career because of that. You can find consistency on civil rights and Medicare for all. He's one of the first people to talk about this and has been one of the most vocal proponents of a single-payer healthcare system on virtually every single issue. It's not just that Bernie Sanders has been right, but he's been a trailblazer. He's the one who is raising the bar and forcing everyone else to keep up with him, and they can barely keep up with him. So when I see all of this, the more I learn about Bernie Sanders, the deeper we dive into his record, the more appealing he becomes, because it just compounds what we already know about him, that he is incredibly consistent. You're not going to find much instances of him contradicting himself, if any. You're not going to find him really taking the wrong stand on an issue. That's rare. It happens, but it is rare. And he's just all around someone who I trust on these issues. When he says that he supports Medicare for all, I can trust that he's being genuine because he said the same damn thing for decades about Medicare for all, when people like Kamala Harris and Elizabeth Warren are only now starting to talk about it. So that's why I'm supporting Bernie Sanders, among other reasons. It's because trustworthy politicians are hard to come by, and you still have to be nuanced and thorough and question all politicians, including Bernie Sanders. But when it comes to consistency and trustworthiness, I'm going to go with the person who actually has a track record on these progressive issues, not just the person who's a Johnny-come-lately, who's only supporting issues like Medicare for all and marijuana legalization because it's politically expedient for them to do that. I'm going to support the person who's been anti-war his whole career and been on the right side of history for the entirety of his career. And I hope that you will too.
You could support the Humanist Report at patreon.com/Humanist Report. But trust me, I'd have way more supporters on Patreon if that was my podcast. Sad.